You're standing high in the Andes Mountains, 4,000 meters above sea level. The air is thin and cold, and every breath feels like a battle. In front of you rises the Cerro Rico, the rich mountain of Potosi, shining with the promise of silver but hiding a brutal truth. Its steep slopes are carved with hundreds of tiny pits and tunnels, and the ground trembles under the weight of countless laborers. Thousands of indigenous people and enslaved workers toil here, their lungs choking on the dust of the mountain. Flickering tallow candles barely light their way as they dig, hammer, and chip at the rock. The year is 1570, and this mountain is not just a source of silver. It is a factory for wealth that will change the world economy forever. This is not just a story from a history book. It is the beginning of a global chain of events that still echoes today. When Spain discovered silver at Potosi in 1545, it did not simply become rich. It created the first ever worldwide flood of money, a massive surge of currency that would shake economies across continents for centuries. The Spanish crown suddenly had more silver than it could handle. It minted coins called pieces of 8 and reals, which became the first currency to travel across the globe. This silver flowed from Bolivia to Manila in the Philippines and to the busy ports of China, fueling a boom in trade that made Spain appear incredibly wealthy. But this wealth was only an illusion. While Spain counted its silver, the real value of the wealth was leaving the country forever. The miners were digging up the mountain and the silver was being shipped east. Europe was rich on paper, but in reality it was emptying itself of tangible value. The silver flowed east in search of goods that Europe could not make. It was drawn to China, where the demand for luxury items like silk and porcelain was insatiable. This was not simple trade. It was a one-way street, a drain of real wealth that Europe could never recover. European nobles were obsessed with these goods. Possessing silk, porcelain, and other luxury items was a status symbol. It demonstrated refinement, power, and a connection to the wider, sophisticated world. Pieces of 8, the lifeblood of Spain's empire in the Americas, were spent eagerly to obtain these items. Silks so soft it felt like liquid and porcelain, so thin it rang like a bell, were traded for silver that had taken years of human labor to extract. But Europe had nothing that China wanted in return. European wool was heavy and unsuitable for China's climate, and other products were considered crude or unnecessary. When European merchants reached the port of Canton, they brought chests overflowing with silver. They returned with exquisite cargo, but their ledgers showed a permanent loss. This was the beginning of a structural trade deficit that would last for centuries. Every vase, every bolt of silk, meant another portion of Spain's tangible wealth had disappeared. The silver drain created a paradox. Spain was the richest nation in the world, yet it was slowly bleeding itself dry. Europe eventually understood the gravity of this problem. The Chinese economy was advanced, sophisticated, and largely self-sufficient. The Middle Kingdom controlled its own industries, producing everything its people needed. China demanded only one thing from foreigners: solid, trustworthy silver. This system was deliberate. The Chinese government restricted trade to a single port, Canton, where they controlled prices and monitored every transaction. Foreign merchants were not equals. They were suppliers of silver, allowed to trade only under strict conditions. This was the start of what could be called a global vacuum. Silver was pulled from the Americas, transported across the oceans, and absorbed directly into the Chinese imperial treasury. It funded China's internal growth, strengthened its economy, and increased its financial independence. Europe, on the other hand, was starved of money. The inflow of silver did not remain in European markets to stimulate growth. It left Europe poorer while it filled the coffers of another empire. Spain should have become permanently wealthy, but instead, the sheer flood of silver caused prices to rise dramatically. This phenomenon, later called the price revolution, meant that money itself lost value. The kingdom that controlled the world's wealth saw its people grow poorer as food and goods became more expensive. Silver, once a symbol of power, became a kind of poison. By the 17th century, Spain declared bankruptcy multiple times despite controlling the richest silver mines in the world. The wealth was flowing around them, but none of it stayed. The rest of Europe watched closely. The flow of silver to China was more than a financial problem, it was a transfer of global power. European nations realized that the imbalance was not just economic. It gave China a strategic advantage. Europe struggled to find a solution. The imbalance led to attempts to force trade through other means. sometimes using force or substances like opium, long before modern globalization began. The silver drain of the Americas to China was one of the first true examples of a global trade deficit. It was a clear lesson that losing a country's real wealth slowly over time has consequences far beyond numbers on a ledger. It reduced Europe's independence, made Spain vulnerable despite its apparent wealth, and shaped the modern world economy. This story is a reminder that real prosperity depends not just on acquiring wealth, but on keeping it and using it wisely. As silver continued its journey from the Americas to China, Europe found itself in a difficult position. The flow was relentless. Ships carried chest after chest of coins across oceans, and each silver bar meant European countries were losing tangible wealth while foreign empires grew stronger. Spain's crown, once the envy of the world, struggled to maintain economic stability. Inflation rose sharply, and everyday life for common people became harder. The value of silver was dropping within Europe even as it was eagerly accepted in China. This imbalance was not due to laziness or poor planning. It was the result of a powerful economic reality. China had everything Europe desired: textiles, ceramics, spices, and luxury goods. Its markets were vast, disciplined, and carefully controlled. The Europeans, on the other hand, had very little to offer in exchange. Woolen fabrics were too heavy for the climate. Small crafted items were seen as primitive, and many of Europe's industrial products did not meet Chinese standards. No matter how much Europe tried, the flow of silver could not be reversed through conventional trade. European merchants quickly learned that access to China was tightly managed. Foreigners could trade only at the port of Canton under strict supervision. All deals were monitored, and prices were set to China's advantage. European traders were essentially delivering silver in exchange for goods they could not reproduce. They were never equals in this system. Over time, this created what could be described as a one-way economic street. Silver went east, goods came west, but European wealth was permanently drained in the process. The drain of silver was massive. To understand the scale, imagine hundreds of ships, each carrying thousands of coins, all flowing into a single country. This inflow transformed China's economy, allowing it to grow internally and strengthen its financial and political power. Meanwhile, European nations, especially Spain, faced a paradox. They controlled the world's silver mines, yet struggled to fund basic needs at home. Their people were becoming poorer as prices rose. Yet on paper, Spain was one of the richest nations in the world. European powers responded in different ways. Some attempted to gain control of other trade routes or find products that China might want. For instance, the British, seeing the persistent trade imbalance, eventually began exporting opium to force a return flow of wealth. This was a dark turn, showing that when a country cannot find a legal or fair way to balance trade, it may resort to coercion. The lesson was clear: if you cannot innovate or produce goods that are desired, the flow of money will always favor the side with scarce, valuable products. While China absorbed silver, it also increased its internal stability. The empire could use the metal to pay its officials, fund public works, and reinforce its military. Unlike Europe, which struggled with inflation and debt, China's careful management of the influx strengthened its economy. The flow of silver was not wasted but used strategically to create long-term prosperity. The contrast between the two continents highlighted a key lesson in economics. Wealth in motion is not the same as wealth that is controlled and used wisely. The European aristocracy, meanwhile, continued to chase luxury items. Silk and porcelain were not just decorations. They were symbols of status, power, and refinement. Possessing these goods signaled that a family or ruler was part of the global elite. For merchants, the pursuit of these items created incentives to continue the flow of silver, reinforcing the one-way system. Every transaction further drained Europe of its hard-mined resources, even as it fueled the rise of Chinese wealth and global influence. Spain, despite its mines, faced repeated financial crises. The crown borrowed heavily to fund wars and public projects, often using the very silver that would soon leave for China. The cycle was exhausting. Wealth arrived from the mines, passed through Spain, and quickly exited to pay for foreign goods or finance military campaigns. Local economies suffered as inflation rose. Peasants and artisans found it harder to make a living. Spain's apparent prosperity was only a surface illusion, a temporary glow hiding deep structural weaknesses. Other European countries learned from Spain's experience and tried to avoid the same mistakes. Merchants and rulers realized that controlling silver alone was not enough. Without the ability to produce desirable goods or manage trade efficiently, wealth would continue to leak to stronger, self-sufficient economies. Nations like England, the Netherlands, and Portugal began to experiment with new trade strategies, including colonization, monopoly trading companies, and the search for commodities that could compete with Chinese goods. The global trade system was evolving. The Americas produced raw materials, Europe processed and transported silver, and China consumed the wealth in exchange for luxury goods. This early version of globalization revealed fundamental truths about economic power. Countries that could produce scarce, highly desired goods controlled the flow of wealth. Those that relied solely on extraction or conquest often found themselves trapped in a cycle of dependency and outflow. The silver drain highlighted how global markets could amplify these effects, creating winners and losers across continents. The human cost of this system was enormous. Miners in Potosi endured brutal conditions, often dying young from respiratory diseases caused by dust and toxic fumes. European commoners struggled with inflation and high prices. Meanwhile, Chinese laborers and craftsmen benefited indirectly from the influx of silver, which allowed their economy to grow and their society to flourish. This contrast underscores a key point. Global trade does not distribute wealth evenly, and power often lies with those who control scarcity and quality. Europe's obsession with luxury goods fueled social and cultural changes. Wealthy families invested heavily in silk, porcelain, and other imported items. Art, fashion, and architecture reflected these desires. Yet these cultural achievements were built on the transfer of wealth from Europe to Asia. The pursuit of prestige came at a cost, both economically and strategically. The more silver Europe spent to maintain appearances, the weaker its economic position became relative to China. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, it was clear that Europe faced structural challenges. The outflow of silver was persistent, and traditional solutions were ineffective. Nations could mint more coins or borrow more money, but these measures could not replace the real, physical wealth leaving the continent. Inflation continued, trade imbalances persisted, and Spain, the initial beneficiary of the silver mines, struggled with repeated bankruptcies. The illusion of power was strong, but the reality was grim. This period set important precedents for modern economics. It demonstrated the dangers of over-reliance on extraction without production, the limits of monetary wealth when it leaves the economy, and the importance of producing goods that are genuinely valued by others. The lessons were not forgotten. Later European powers would study these patterns, seeking ways to reverse trade imbalances and regain control of wealth flows. But for the 16th and 17th centuries, the silver drain from the Americas to China defined the global economy. In summary, the silver flowing east reshaped the world. It strengthened China, weakened Spain, and created a blueprint for global trade and imbalance. Europe's desire for luxury drove a one-way system that drained its wealth while boosting another empire. The human cost was immense, the social consequences profound, and the lessons enduring. Europe learned that controlling resources alone is not enough. Understanding trade, demand, and economic power is essential. As Europe struggled with the continuous outflow of silver, nations began searching for ways to regain control over global wealth. The Spanish crown had already shown the danger of relying solely on mining. Despite possessing the richest silver mines in the world, repeated bankruptcies proved that extraction alone could not sustain an empire. Other European powers studied these failures and tried to learn from them. England, the Netherlands, and Portugal all sought ways to create new trade networks, secure rare goods, and find commodities that could compete in markets dominated by China. Colonization became one solution. European nations established overseas settlements, ports, and trading posts, hoping to access new resources and markets directly. The Dutch, for instance, created the Dutch East India Company, which controlled trade in spices and other valuable commodities in Asia. The British and Portuguese followed similar paths. These ventures aimed to bypass intermediaries, reduce costs, and gain control over goods that were in high demand. Yet even with these strategies, Europe still faced the reality that China's goods remained unmatched in quality and desirability. The trade deficit remained a persistent challenge. Europe could not simply force China to accept its products. Attempts to use coercion, like pushing opium into Chinese markets, highlighted the limitations of traditional trade. Economic power alone could not reverse the flow of wealth if demand and quality were not aligned. The Chinese monopoly over silk, porcelain, and other luxury items continued to draw silver eastward. Europe had to innovate or find alternative strategies, and these efforts would shape the next few centuries of global trade. One of the lasting effects of this silver drain was the rise of mercantilism. European governments began to take a more active role in controlling trade, accumulating wealth, and regulating imports and exports. They realized that relying on market forces alone was insufficient to balance global trade. Policies were enacted to encourage domestic production of desirable goods, establish colonies, and secure trade monopolies. These measures reflected the hard lesson learned from Spain's experience. Wealth that leaves the economy is lost power, influence, and stability. Meanwhile, China used the influx of silver to strengthen its internal systems. The empire paid officials, funded public works, and reinforced social stability. Silver became part of a carefully managed financial ecosystem. Unlike Europe, which experienced inflation and recurring financial crises, China's economy benefited from the careful absorption of wealth. This contrast reinforced the lesson that how wealth is managed can be as important as how it is acquired. Culturally, Europe's fascination with luxury goods shaped society in profound ways. Aristocrats and wealthy merchants spent fortunes on silk, porcelain, and other imported items. These goods were symbols of power, status, and connection to a wider world. Art, architecture, and fashion all reflected this obsession. Yet beneath the surface, this pursuit came at a steep economic cost. Every elegant robe or finely crafted vase represented silver that had left Europe, never to return. The human consequences were also significant. Miners in the Andes worked under harsh and dangerous conditions, often dying from toxic dust and accidents. European peasants faced rising prices and decreasing purchasing power, while Chinese craftsmen and laborers indirectly benefited from the wealth pouring into their economy. This asymmetry highlighted a fundamental truth about global trade. Wealth flows to those who control production of scarce, highly valued goods, while those supplying raw materials may see little long-term benefit. Over time, European nations began to adjust. They developed new industries, invested in production of goods that could compete globally, and sought to establish trading networks that allowed for more balanced exchanges. The silver drain had shown that simply possessing money or resources was insufficient. The ability to produce and offer products that others valued was crucial. These lessons laid the groundwork for later economic developments, including the rise of industrialization and global trade networks in the centuries to follow. The story of silver from Potosi is more than just a historical account. It illustrates the principles that continue to shape modern economies. Trade deficits, wealth distribution, and the balance of power are not abstract concepts. They have real consequences for societies, governments, and individuals. The silver flowing to China demonstrates that a country can be rich on paper yet weak in practice if its wealth is continually exported without strategic planning. By the end of the 17th century, the world had changed. China had grown stronger and wealthier. Europe had learned hard lessons about trade and economic management, and the Americas had become central to a global exchange network. The cycle of extraction, shipment, and imbalance continued for generations, shaping the rise and fall of empires and the movement of wealth across continents. The Great Silver Drain serves as a warning and a lesson. Prosperity built on extraction and export, without control or balance, is fragile. Power flows with wealth, and losing tangible resources can weaken even the strongest empires. Europe's experience highlights the need for innovation, strategic trade, and the production of goods that others truly desire. Without these, a nation risks becoming a supplier to more powerful economies, losing autonomy and influence. In the end, the story of Potosi and the flow of silver is a story of human ambition, ingenuity, and the complex forces of the global economy. It is about the lives of miners, merchants, rulers, and artisans whose actions created a system of trade that spanned continents. It is about wealth, power, and the consequences of imbalance. And it is about lessons that remain relevant today. Real prosperity depends not just on acquiring resources, but on managing them wisely, understanding global demand, and ensuring that wealth strengthens the society that produces it. The echoes of Potosi can still be felt in today's world. Modern trade, globalization, and economic policy continue to reflect the principles demonstrated centuries ago. The movement of resources, the desire for rare and valued goods, and the management of wealth are still central to how nations interact. Europe's silver drain to China reminds us that economic power is not simply about possession, but about control, strategy, and the ability to create goods that the world values. Ultimately, the history of silver is a story of balance and imbalance, of human ambition and natural resources, of societies learning hard lessons through trial and consequence. It teaches that true wealth is not just measured in coins or bullion, but in the stability, autonomy, and productive capacity of a nation. And as we look at modern global trade, these lessons remain as relevant as they were over 400 years ago, a reminder that the past often holds the keys to understanding the present.